Welcome to the Profile Corner. In today's video, we'll be comparing a Milwaukee 2 horsepower router that I bought in 1991 with a Milwaukee 2 1/4 horsepower router that I bought last year. Recently, a viewer of my video suggested that I compare some of the heavy-duty tools of years past with what's available today, and I thought that this would be a good comparison between the different routers to see how far things have advanced over the years. I checked on Milwaukee's website a few days ago, and I see that the Milwaukee 2 1/4 horsepower router is no longer in production. So it must be that production ended recently. You can still find it out on some websites in stock. And so if you're interested in one of those Milwaukee 2 1/4 horsepower body grip routers with variable speed, you may want to pick one up while you can. Of course, they also show up out on eBay once in a while. Okay, I'm going to tip the camera down so that you can see what I've got sitting in front of me. In front of me, I've got 4 Milwaukee routers that are from the early 1990s or even before then, as well as 4 of the Milwaukee body grip routers that are much more recent introductions. I'll tip the camera down now so that you can see these better. This is the Milwaukee 5680 2 horsepower router that I bought in July of 1991. I bought this to replace the Craftsman 1 1/2 horsepower router that had a Collet engineering design flaw that prevented it from successfully grasping onto router bits after the router's been used for a few months or a few years. The Collet on that particular 1 1/2 horsepower Craftsman router is integrated into the motor shaft, and so it's not replaceable. This Milwaukee 5680 router in 1991 cost $219 new. I'll show you the advertisement of the router in the Tools on Sale listing that I found in a Fine Woodworking magazine from January 1991. The price was the same later on in the year. However, the Tools on Sale listing was smudged in some of the later magazines, and so I used the advertisement from January 1991. As you can see on the screen, the Milwaukee router sold for $219 in 1991, and adjusted for inflation, that is $522.26 in 2025. So I essentially bought a $522 router that was just a 2 horsepower router. Of course, this was US made, as were almost all the Milwaukee tools at that time. The 5680 router has a 5670 router motor. However, the assembled unit in its base is sold as a 5680. So if you see these out on eBay, they may be listed as either a 5670 or a 5680. And if you decide to buy one, it may be a good purchase because mine still works fine. Although when I took it out of the router table, after it had been in the router table for quite some time, it didn't want to actually turn on. The switch got plugged up with sawdust, and it took a while to get that cleared out so that it would work again. Next to it is a Milwaukee 5680 router, which is also 2 horsepower again, that I picked up on eBay in October of 2024 for $55. I thought that was a screaming deal. I was looking for a backup for my Milwaukee 2 horsepower router in case it decided to die, so that I had a router to go into the router table, and that would also allow me to pull this router out and actually use it freehand, because I enjoyed using it freehand at the time that I put it into the router table, because it has some nice beefy handles on it that allow a good grip of the router. Now, this router unfortunately has a partially broken power switch. I don't know if I'll be able to 3D print a new power switch to replace that or not, but that may be something that I'll try later on. Behind it is a Milwaukee 5660 router, which you can see here. It's essentially the same as a 2 horsepower router, except that this spins at a different speed. The Milwaukee 5680 router has a no-load speed of 26,000 RPM. The speed of the 1 1/2 horsepower router is slower than that, but the slowness actually depends on how old the router is. Right next to it is another Milwaukee 5660 router that I also picked up on eBay. This router I picked up for $45.29 in October 2024 after I found the 2 horsepower router out there. I thought that this was a good deal. However, this has got a little bit of an issue with it that we'll talk about later on. Milwaukee actually changed their collet design partway through the manufacturing cycle of these routers, and so this actually has an older style collet than the other routers that I've got here, and it's not compatible with the collets of these other routers. And so this came with a 1/4 inch collet, and that's all that it will accept is 1/4 inch bits. I'll show you this a little bit more closely later on. This other 1.5 horse Milwaukee router I picked up on eBay for $79.99 in October 2024. This seems to be a pretty decent router. It's still in good shape, as were all these routers. They actually work just fine. I had to blow them out a little bit. This one I had in my router table, and so I removed the ring, and I had some difficulty getting the ring to reinstall once I took it out of the router table. So I have to experiment with that a little bit and see if I can get that remounted onto the router. And now I'll give you a close-up view of the 2 horsepower router. The cord unfortunately has become frayed over the years due to being under constant stress in the router table. It still works fine. I should probably put some electrical tape on this to make it so that it's less likely to come apart fully. But this is what it looks like. Here you can see that there's an adjustment ring and a lock knob that can be loosened up, and as long as this is riding in the groove, you can see the groove right here, you're able to raise the router up and down using this ring. It does work fine, but it's usually best to make the adjustments when it's on a work table so that it's easy to control. Whereas when it's on an angle up here for the camera, it's a little bit harder for it to be adjusted. And when it's on a flat surface, it works just fine as long as the pin doesn't get out of that groove that's on the other side. As you can see in here, this is a self-releasing collet, which means that when you stick a bit in and you tighten this down and then you use it to get the bit back out, you need to turn the collet nut until you get resistance, and then usually once it frees up, and then you'll have to turn it a little bit more until you get resistance again, and then the bit will come out. And as you can see here, it has kind of a small opening in the base plate for the router bit to come through. That opening was actually smaller than that originally. I had some router bits that I needed to run in here for edge profiling, and those were ever so slightly too wide to fit through the base plate hole, and so I just used the router bits to open up this hole to be a little bit wider. And unfortunately I lost access to these 2 screws here, which are intended to hold certain things in place in the base plate. And now let's take a closer look at the Milwaukee 5616-20 router, which once again was recently discontinued by Milwaukee. It appears that they're still producing the 1 3/4 horsepower router, so I'm not sure why they discontinued the 2 1/4 horsepower. Tectonic Industries, which owns the Milwaukee line now, is based in Hong Kong, China. It acquired Milwaukee in 2005. TTI also owns or is licensed to build tools for Rigid, AEG, Ryobi, Hoover, Dirt Devil, Hart, Homelight, and a variety of other manufacturing brands. This router cost $209 last year, which in $1991 is just $87. So if this router existed back in 1991, it would cost $87 versus the 5680 router, which costs $219 in 1991. So that's quite a dramatic difference between these two. Of course, this one is made in the United States, as well as these other 3. I've got a US-made Milwaukee 1 3/4 horsepower router back here in the back, but they long since stopped producing these in the United States. While this 2 1/4 horsepower router is listed as discontinued by the manufacturer, I was able to find it still listed out on some websites for $240, including Great Lakes Power Tools website. There's also a couple other websites out there that have the Milwaukee router still listed as in stock. In January of this year, I also picked up another one of these 2¼ horsepower routers on eBay. I won an auction listing. It was a refurbished 2¼ horsepower router for $115.50. I have the motor from that router now mounted into a different base, which is back here, and we'll talk about that later on. And unfortunately, I tried buying another one of these 2¼ horsepower routers on eBay in March, and after I paid $138 for it, and it showed up on April Fool's Day, I found out that it was actually only a 1¾ horsepower router, and the motor, while it said that it was remanufactured by Milwaukee, actually sounds like it has a bad bearing in it. That's a little bit problematic. Regarding the 1¾ horsepower routers, the model 5615-29 was a US assembled router. The 5615-20 is the one that's built in China. It's my understanding that they also produce some of these 2¼ horsepower routers in the United States with a slightly different model number. I don't recall what that model number is. It may have been 5616-29 or something like that as a guess. Okay, so I'm going to bring this closer up to the camera so that you're able to see it. This is called a body grip router, which means that in addition to being able to hold it using the handles, as you see here, you can also use it as a big trim router just by putting your hand into the grip, and now you can hold on to it with one hand to use it. I've used the router this way quite a few times in videos because that allows me to have my left hand free so that I'm able to hold the board down to the workbench while I'm using the router with my other hand. You can see here that it also has a speed adjustment dial on it. The 2¼ horsepower router is the only one that has that speed adjustment dial. The 1¾ horsepower router does not have a dial in that location, as you can see here, and so this runs at a fixed speed, which is not so good when you're using large diameter router bits. We'll talk about a way of getting around that later on. Okay, there's a power switch here that's in a nice convenient location. Out in the reviews for this router, there were quite a few people saying that the switch becomes defective after a while. Very likely sawdust gets up inside of it and keeps it from working right. And of course, I've got a Bosch 2¼ horsepower router that's had that same problem with its power switch. And so it's not a Milwaukee only thing. It would be nice if they had this a little bit more sealed than it is. It also has a strap here that acts as a release so that you can adjust the height. And you're able to adjust the height up here just by turning this little dial. And the interesting thing about that is that that actually pokes through the bottom here, the base, and they give you a little T-wrench that goes into there. And so if you've got this mounted into a router table, you can insert the little T-wrench into the hole and actually adjust the height of the router bit in the base. And then of course, once you get it into the right location, you just clamp it back down, and now it won't move. Now it's not able to move up here either. This has the optional dust collection attachment onto it. When I picked up the Milwaukee router back here in the mid-2000s, I bought this at either Home Depot or Lowe's, and it came with the dust collection kit. I thought this looked like it was a joke because of how narrow the opening is up inside for the chips to actually pass through. And so I ended up throwing that away, not realizing that it would be helpful to have. And so I had to buy 2 additional dust collection attachments for the routers so that I'm able to hook up my Festool dust extractor to the router to collect chips. So the chips don't end up all over the floor. So this is now an optional item. We'll talk about that later. I'll give you the part number for it. You can still find some sites out on the internet that sell these. They're a little bit difficult to find. And this has a self-releasing collet, just like the Portacable routers and the Bosch routers, where you actually have to loosen this up twice. So you loosen it until you get resistance. Once you break that resistance, then you have to turn it a couple times, and then you'll get resistance again, and then you have to break that resistance so that you're able to take out the router bit. Okay, let's do a quick comparison of the collets for the two routers. These are both 1/4 inch collets, as you can see here. This is for the older router. It fits into a nut that goes into this section right here, and that same nut is shared with both the 1/2 inch and the 1/4 inch collets. This is a 1/4 inch collet for the newer Milwaukee router, and as you can see here, the nut comes along with the collet, so there's a separate nut for the 1/2 inch collet as well. The design is somewhat similar. This is from 1991, and this is from 2024. Looks like they're similar lengths, and so they've got similar amount of grasping capability of the router bit shank. Now last year when I picked up these other routers, they didn't come with both the 1/4 inch and the 1/2 inch collets. They only came with the 1/4 inch collets. I found a company out on eBay that still had new in the package router bit collets that'll fit into these older routers. So here's a 1/2 inch collet. This is a model number 48-66-1010. And here's the 1/4 inch collet, 48-66-0985. Okay, these collets will fit into 3 of the 4 routers I've got back here. The 4th one, which is an older design, has a completely different looking collet, as you can see here. And so this collet is not compatible with the collets for those other similar looking routers. I've got some documentation that I found online that was in the Milwaukee manual that lists out here different model numbers. There's a 5620 Milwaukee router, which I don't have, and that was just a 1 horsepower router. And starting with serial number 451-12247, they switched over to the newer style Milwaukee Collets. And here for the 1.5 horsepower routers, starting out with serial number 452-19550, they switched over to the newer style Collets. For the 2 horsepower routers, they started out with serial number 608-2566. And if we take a look at the badge on this one, it looks like this is serial number 452-9453. And so this precedes the change of the collet style that's listed in the manufacturing instructions. I mentioned previously that the older Milwaukee routers have a very small opening in their base plate, sometimes called the sub base. And the reason for that is that this was designed to accept portacable style guide bushings. This is 1 3/8 inch in diameter. I've got a set of Milwaukee guide bushings here that I bought just recently. I've also got another set that I bought in the early 2000s from Milwaukee that looks identical to this. And this set will actually fit right down into the opening here. It's supposed to sit flush. There, now it's sitting flush. And then there's a ring that goes on the underside that screws in. And then you're able to use this with dovetail jigs and other jigs that you build yourself to run against this guide bushing to guide the router bit through the cut. So that's a nice thing that this has that the newer Milwaukee routers do not have. Well, there's a catch there. I'll talk about that in just a moment. In order to use those guide bushings with the newer Milwaukee routers, you actually have to buy this sub base. It's clear, and it has a 1 3/8 inch center hole. It looks like they also give you a screwdriver bit to take out the old sub base and put in a new one. I've got one of these that's already open. I don't think it's this one that I could show you. The interesting thing is that this sub base comes pre-installed on another base that you can buy for the router. This is a plunge base for the router. And here, as you can see here, it comes with that clear base pre-installed on it. So that's kind of a nice feature that they give that to you. And so if you buy this base, you're also able to get the clear sub base and then use those Porter-Cable style guide bushings with your Milwaukee router. This base, by the way, is one of the bases that's available for this router motor. I had significant difficulty actually getting this router motor to actually seat down inside. I tried about 6 different Milwaukee router motors, and then I finally came back to this 2 1/4 horsepower router motor, managed to squeeze it in using some screwdrivers to help guide it in. It was quite a challenge, and so I'll never be taking it out of this base. I picked up this Plunge base for the router for $99 from Great Lakes Power Tools last year. I thought that this Plunge base was handy compared with a Bosch 1617 EVS router because you get an extra inch of up and down travel with this Plunge base. As you can see there's quite a bit of travel, and it also works smoothly where I had difficulty with the new Bosch 1617 EVS router that I bought that arrived in January of this year, where it didn't operate as smoothly as this. I managed to fix that so that it does operate as smoothly as this. But this was a good investment for $99. Unfortunately, that company does not appear to have these in stock right now. I don't know if Milwaukee's no longer producing the Plunge base for this router motor or not, but I did find it listed out on different websites on the internet for quite a bit more money than $99. I'm not sure if those are legitimate websites or not. You would want to check them out. By the way, this $99 that I paid for this Plunge base is exactly the same as what I paid for the Bosch Plunge base for a very small Bosch Colt trim router. And so this Milwaukee Plunge base was actually a good investment, I believe, whereas this Plunge base for the Bosch trim router was less of a good value. This Plunge base is model number 48-10-5600. Milwaukee also offered a D-handle router base that'll fit this router motor. The D-handle base is model number 48-10-5619. It's not clear if that D-handle base is still available from Milwaukee or not. I did see it listed out on several websites for right around $166. So if you like D-handle routers more than you like the body grip routers, that may be a good option for you. This clear sub base that works with the guide bushings is model number 49-54-1027. I bought this one through eBay, and it actually ended up coming from Great Lakes Power Tools. If you buy it directly from Great Lakes Power Tools, they sell it for $18. If you buy it through their eBay store, it's a little bit more expensive than that. Milwaukee also offers a clear sub base with a 2.5-inch diameter hole that is part number 49-54-1028. And that was listed at $10 out on Cripe Distributing's website. Okay, the dust collection hookup that I mentioned before, which you can see here, I bought from Cripe Distributing on their eBay site for $18. The part number is 49-54-5615. I didn't see this listed out on that website anymore, and so you may get it from a different source, and you may find that it actually sells for close to $30, if not more than that now. It does collect quite a bit of the chips, especially when you're using a dovetail bit, but for edge profiling, it doesn't do a good job at all. Okay, let's talk about edge guides. I've got an old Porter-Cable 42690 edge guide here, and I put these pins in the outer 2 holes. There's a newer style version of this that you can sometimes find out on eBay, new in the package, that actually has 3 sets of holes. I put these studs into the outside holes, and I thought, this is going to work perfectly for these older 2 1/4 horse and 1.5 horsepower Milwaukee routers. The spacing is almost exactly perfect, but it's off by maybe a 1/16 of an inch from going into the holes. So I'm not sure what you'd use for router edge guides for these older routers. You could possibly build one yourself, or maybe you could even modify one of these porta cable edge guides so that it'll fit. For the newer Milwaukee routers, I found another porta cable edge guide out on eBay. This one, once again, has the 3 holes on each side. And these rods were originally supposed to go into these middle holes here. However, if you put them into the center holes, and then you grind them down, taking off maybe a couple thousandths, you can actually get these to slide in to the holes that are in the Milwaukee bases. And then you can use this as an edge guide. I've got the screws in here and they're tightened down right now. And so I'm not able to insert it in. In addition to that, when you've got the dust collection hookup on it, as you can see here, those holes are already being used for the dust collection. And so you're not able to use the dust collection hookup at the same time you're using the edge guide with these newer Milwaukee routers. I didn't see any kind of dust collection hookup option for the older Milwaukee routers. That wasn't quite such a concern back in the early 1990s, I suppose, for the manufacturers to have some way of collecting dust at their machines. And as I mentioned earlier, the Milwaukee 2¼ horsepower routers have variable speed control, which is beneficial to have when you're using different size router bits. Generally, when you run a larger diameter router bit, you need to slow the speed down, so you'd end up picking a slower number here, and you'd use a higher number for the very smallest bits. Sometimes there's labeling on the router bit packages, such as the white side packages, that suggests what speed you want to run the router motor at. This Milwaukee 2 horsepower router that I bought in 1991, however, only has a single speed of 26,000 RPM. I had to use this router in the router table, however, to run a 3.5 inch diameter panel raising bit, and so I needed to slow the speed down, and to do that, I bought a speed controller unit here, which you can see. This actually adjusts the voltage that goes to the router so that it decreases from 120 volts down to a smaller number. Not all routers will respond to that change. For instance, I've got a porta cable 890 router, which has variable speed built into it, and that would not work with this router motor controller. This, I believe, I sourced from MLSC. I bought this probably around 2001. And I've had it available whenever I need to run a larger diameter router bit in that older router table that I've got. Okay, so let's try this out. I've got this set so that it's at full speed on this toggle switch. And so if I power on this router, it should be running at 26,000 RPM. Okay, now I'll turn it back on, and I'll set it so that this is controlling the speed. You'll notice that it's slow right now, just by turning it on to the controller here. And now if I adjust the style, you can slow it down to nothing. Now the voltage is so low that the router motor won't spin. Cutting the voltage like this could actually cause the motor to heat up due to the lower than expected voltage, and so you wouldn't want to use this very frequently. But it can work if you don't have any other way to control the speed. Now this controller will actually work with the newer Milwaukee routers as well. So now I'll plug in the one that I bought in the mid-2000s. This is a 1¾ horsepower router. Looks like it's already turned on. We'll turn it off. And then I'll reset this back to full power. Okay, and plug it in. Okay, we'll turn it on here and see what it sounds like. Okay, so this router from the mid-2000s, which was assembled in the United States, sounds essentially the same as the router from 1991. And now I'll turn it back on, and then I'll adjust the speed using this dial. Okay, so this Milwaukee router works with the speed control. And since Milwaukee took the 2¼ horsepower router off the market, they discontinued it, and they left us 1¾ horsepower router motor on the market still. If you need to run larger diameter router bits, the only option is to buy a motor controller like this one that adjusts the voltage going into the router motor. That's kind of unfortunate. Maybe they'll introduce a different model that has the variable speed or something like that in the near future. Or maybe they've gone full battery operated router and they're discarding the plug-in larger routers. And now let's compare it with a 561620 2¼ horsepower router that has variable speed built into it. This is not actually the one with the variable speed. The one with variable speed is actually over here, just off camera. So I need to get this one plugged in real quick. Okay, we'll turn it on, see what it sounds like. This is at the maximum speed, which they've got labeled at 7. And you may have noticed that unlike the 2 horsepower Milwaukee router from 1991 and also the 1¾ horsepower router, this 2¼ horsepower router has soft start, which means that when it turns on, it doesn't come up to fast speed immediately. Instead, it comes up to speed gradually, which means that this won't jerk in my hands. So that's a nice improvement over the 1¾ horsepower router. The 2¼ horsepower Portacable 890 router also has soft start like that, whereas the 690 routers do not. So there's maximum speed. Let's turn it down. So that's probably the speed you would run that 3½ inch diameter router bit at. Maybe up a little bit from that. Maybe right there. I'm going to get everything cleared off the workbench, and then we'll do a little bit of test routing with these routers. I have an OG fillet router bit mounted into the old router. I've got it set to take a depth of cut about 9/16 of an inch. Here on the table I've got several different types of wood that you would probably find at a hardware store in North America. I've got white pine, redwood, mahogany, hard maple, red oak, black walnut, and cherry. So what I'll do is I'll put one of these in the center of the table, and I'll route it with the old router, and then I'll put another type of wood in the center of the table and route it also with this old router. And then once I get all these cut, then I'll switch over to using the newer router with the same bit, and then we'll do a comparison. I've got 2 3/4 inch boards stuck together using double-sided tape, and so that should allow me to pull them apart afterwards. And as you can see here, I've got new written on one side, and I've got old written on the other side, so that way we'll be able to tell which router performed which cut. Unfortunately, the redwood here is less than 3/4 of an inch thick. It's about 11/16, or maybe a little bit less than that. And what that means is that the bearing could end up touching the board that's on the bottom and distorting the cut a little bit. So we'll have to watch out for that. I'll get the router bit swapped over to the other router, and then we'll do a comparison of the quality of the cut. And I've got the router mat taped down now so that it does not slide around nearly as much as it did when I was using the older 2 horsepower router. I should mention that the older 2 horsepower router is rated at 12 amps. The newer 2 1/4 horsepower router is rated at 13 amps. Okay, let's take a look at the cut quality. This was cut with an old router. As you can see there, it's very clean all the way around. There's no burn marks. Of course, it's a nearly new router bit, and so we shouldn't expect to have any burn marks. I was moving the router at about the right pace with each of these boards so that we minimize the chances of splintering and also burning of the wood. Now let's take a look at the result for the new router. It looks pretty much the same all the way around. Okay, so that was the white pine. Here's the redwood. This is the old router again. Okay, the new router. Redwood is subject to splintering quite easily, especially when the grain's not running true to the edge of the board. And I don't see any splintering here on either side. Here's the oak. Oak looks pretty clean. Oak is also somewhat susceptible to splintering. This all looks good all the way around. Now for the new router, this looks good all the way around as well. Next up is a mahogany. I don't see any problems with splintering here. This cut pretty easily with both routers. Here's the new router. Pretty much the same result. Here's the hard maple. It looks clean all the way around. This burn mark here was from the table saw. That's from the Forest 40-tooth combination blade. So that looks clean all the way around. No burning at all on the maple. For the new router side, it looks just as good all the way around. Here's the cherry. Cherry is quite susceptible to burning as well. I don't see any burning on this at all. This is the old router side. I'd say that looks good all the way around. Here's the new router side. Looks clean all the way around. That's a little bit of a knot right there. So no burning on cherry or maple. Here's the black walnut. This is old router side. Those cuts all look clean to me. Okay, and here's the new router side. It looks just as good. Okay, so overall, the old router is still a quite effective tool. The one issue that I've got with it, potentially, is that the height adjustment is a little bit awkward, and maybe that just needs to be attended to a little bit so that it works right. The newer router works fine as well. I do like that the newer router has speed control built into it, whereas that was not a consideration years ago. It's possible that Milwaukee's 3.5 horsepower router that they marketed at the time had speed control. I know that the Bosch 3.25 horsepower plunge router, the 611 EVS, that offered multiple speeds. We may take a look at that in a later video. So I've got a couple other videos planned in the near future that compare the old Workhorse machines with some of the newer variants that are roughly equivalent in terms of performance. So those videos will be coming out soon. I spent a little bit of money on some of the new equipment, so we should get some interesting results. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye.